Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today to talk about moving out of London, looking for a school specifically. I'm Melanie Sanderson. I'm the managing editor of the Good Schools Guide. So first of all, we're going to just take a little look at what we do. I'll just brief you very, very quickly on the Good Schools Guide. First of all, we were founded in 1986. So we've been around for about 35 years now. We cover 1,300 schools across the UK. So that's about 1,000 state schools, 1,000 independent schools and about 300 state schools. And we review that many schools in great detail. So we also have information on the data of every school in the country, but it's 1,300 that we review in detail. And what that means is that we have visited them. We've interviewed their head teachers, and we have interviewed parents and pupils. So we know them inside and out, and we know their admissions officers and everybody within the school. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. Our writers come from all manner of professions. The one thing we have in common is that we are all parents. We have lawyers, we have journalists, former marketing executives. So we take a really broad approach to reviewing schools, and we bring all our experience with us when we visit them, and try to ask all the right questions, so that what we really try to give to our readers is a view of a school that you would not find in the prospectus. So we're digging deeply into the ethos and the culture of the school, what the lunches are like, whether your child is likely to make the sports teams if they're not an outstanding sports person, how much homework there is, all those kinds of things that you need to know. And most importantly, the kind of culture of the parent body, because it's obviously important to parents that they fit in with the school community as well. We have a huge body of consultants working with us. All of us are reviewers. All of us have visited schools, and we are available to help guide you. If you're moving out of London, or sometimes people are relocating from another country, we're on hand to help them find the perfect school for their child. So if you're interested in that service, please do look on our website for more details, and it's very much explained in detail on there. And finally, the most important thing to understand is that we are totally independent. We're the only school reviewer who does not accept any money from schools to publish their reviews. So no school can pay to be included, and indeed no school can choose to be excluded from the guide. If we decide that we want them in, then in they go. So totally independent, and so you can really guarantee that you're getting the facts when you read one of our reviews. So when you start to think about moving out of London, you will no doubt be feeling at this moment under intense pressure. Living in London is a pressurized environment. The school places there are incredibly competitive, as you all know, and I have no doubt that if you already have a child, the chatter around the nursery gates or the school gates, whatever stage you're at the moment, will be all about where are they going next? Have you got your name down for here, there, and everywhere? And I think it's important to, first of all, in the London context, to try and disconnect yourself from that narrative. When you move out of London, the narrative becomes very much more relaxed, which is a great relief to all of us when we move out. So suddenly you're not worrying so much about putting your child's name down for a nursery at birth. There's a more relaxed approach, and you've got much more time to consider your options. So first thing to say is, if you're moving out of London, you will be able to pause and breathe and really assess your options and think about what is best for your child. The first piece of advice that I would give when you're starting to look at what kind of school you might want to consider, and where you might want to move to make that become a reality, is really sit down and consider making a list, a spreadsheet if you like, and whatever works for you. But there are lots of things that you'll need to take into account. So first up, do you want a state school or do you want a private school? The landscape outside of London for both of these sectors is really, really different. Obviously, far less heavily subscribed. and far less competitive on both sides. So have a think about which path you want to go down, or indeed if you want to mix and match, because again, that becomes a little bit more straightforward outside of London. With a less competitive private secondary school system, the reality of putting your child through a state primary school and then moving them to private school aged 11 becomes much more of a reality. So do some homework and see whether you think that might be an option for you. Single sex schools versus co-educational. A lot of parents come to us and say, we're looking for a co-ed school outside of London for our child. And sometimes we have to take a deep breath and let them know that that's going to be a real challenge, because in many areas, exactly the same as in London, there are the school culture tends to be much more veered towards single sex schools than co-ed. So do think about that and do look at your options before you make that move, if that's really important to you. I've already touched on entrance requirements, but it's suffice to say that it's a much more mixed bag outside of London. Less tutoring will be required, less pressure, fewer candidates for every place. So really, the advice there is understand what the requirements are, but again, breathe, pause, and really consider whether your child is going to fit the bill for the school. But the chances are that if you're looking at a broad range, you'll find something that you're very happy with outside of London, because there's just a much more mixed availability. Travel time. This is always an interesting one when we talk to parents moving outside of London, because they might say that they're living in one area, and we might recommend a school that's 4 or 5 miles away for prep or primary, and actually that always draws a sharp intake of breath from a London parent, because they know how long it takes to travel from, for example, Clapham to Putney in rush hour. It's a very short distance, but it can take a couple of hours. Well, that's just not the case outside of London. It's very feasible to live in one area and send your child to school in a neighbouring town, and your travel time really shouldn't be heavily impacted. If you're traveling 4 or 5 miles, I would expect that to be a normal 10 or 15 minute drive. And guess what? You can often park the car as well. So that's one less thing to worry about. But also you'll be wanting to take into account your commute and your lifestyle, and thinking about how far, how long you want to travel into town. And again, that is often a very personal choice. But when you're thinking about schools, you might want to consider, if you've got to get on a train a little bit earlier, have they got wraparound care? Do they have a breakfast club? Can they hang on to your child at the end of the school day, and until what time? So lots and lots to think about when you start to think about moving out of London. But my overall message is really that you will not be subject to the same pressures that you are in London. It is a totally different kettle of fish. So rest assured that your life will, the pace will slow down if that's what you're looking for. So starting out, looking at prep schools and primary schools, there's a misconception that you can just stroll into any good primary school outside of London, and that isn't at all the case. Your top state primary schools are often as sought after as in London, although I would say that it's rare outside of London to find a school where the catchment areas are quite so tight. So I know that in many parts of the capital, you're looking at a 250 metre from the school gates catchment, and that is very, very rare outside of London. So if you get your timings right, sending your child to the primary school in the town or village where you move to should be an achievable objective. It isn't the same scramble that you find in London, but nonetheless, don't get caught out. Do your homework. Make sure you visit the school, find out what the catchment is. You can look at all the data on the internet of how far the catchment spread in previous years. So if you're looking to buy a house in the catchment area for a specific primary school, make sure that you really do that homework carefully, because you don't want to be caught out at the last minute and not get in. in terms of how good the schools are, look at the Ofsteds, of course, but also if you know people that live in the area, talk to local people, find out where their children go to school, sort of get your ear to the ground and find out what the word is on the street, because sometimes there's a sort of a misconception that the local village school is all very nurturing. Sometimes that's not the case, particularly in grammar school areas. They are driving those kids very hard from the word go, and that may or may not be what you're looking for. So ask around, talk to people, keep your ear to the ground, and really dig deep. Don't just look at the league tables and SAT scores, because there's so much more to a school than that. So try and find out about what their extracurricular offerings are, how they handle sports. If you've got a child with special educational needs, make sure that you are given access to the SENCO, and to talk about their needs and requirements before you join the school. Moving on to prep schools. Prep school places are far more readily available outside of London than in. I have yet to hear of a prep school outside of London where you have to put your name out of birth. So that's the good news. But what I would say is that whereas in London, although you do have the differences in cultures and ethos, the focus of a prep school is, broadly speaking, academic. The focus is to get them into those top London day schools, and you're not under any illusion that breadth is necessarily a part of the offering. And that's really different outside of London, because you'll find a whole mix of schools, and some will quite proudly say, we're not the most academic school in the area, but we have excellent sport, or we're very nurturing, or our SEN department is fantastic. Some will claim that they are, far more academically pushy. Some will be very happy to say, yes, we will help your child prepare for an 11 plus to a state grammar school. Some schools will say, nope, that's not our bag. You stay with us until you're 13 or go somewhere else. So it's really important to understand the focus of the schools and the culture. And the other thing that I would also say is try and work out whether it's important to you that the parent body is very local to your prep school, or whether you're happy to take your child to play dates, 20, 25, 30 minutes away. And for them, as they grow up, not to have so many local friends. That's a real question to ask. But the most important thing, again, is to really look at the destination schools. Which secondary schools do these prep schools feed into? And does that fit with what you're looking for? And the one thing that I would say is try and choose a school where there is breadth. Try and choose a school where if you're looking at a grammar school area, then they'll help you with that. If you're looking at private schools, that's on the agenda. And maybe if public school or boarding is on your agenda, then a school where they're equally happy for them to leave at 11 or 13. Because speaking from experience, of my own experience, and dealing with many, many clients over the years, you may start out on your school journey thinking that you want one thing, and then as time progresses, you may find that you want something else entirely. So if you can find a school that offers that breadth and can direct you in a number of different channels, then that is something to be highly recommended. So moving on to look at independent schools. I've already commented on the fact that co-educational schools are quite unusual in some areas. So do bear that in mind. If co-ed is high on your wish list, really do your homework, just not only to be sure that you live within a reasonable distance of the school, but also that your child has a feasible chance of getting in. Because, of course, if you're looking at co-ed, there are half as many places for each gender. So if it's a very academic school, you may find yourself almost back into the same situation that you were in London in terms of the competition. So do keep your options open in terms of what you're looking for. And if you're moving around that secondary school time, as I said with the primary schools, try and look for breadth. if it's a case of competitive entry, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I always say to my clients when they're looking at secondary school, aim high for your child, be ambitious for them by all means, and do shoot for the stars, but also have a realistic option and always have a backup as well that you are totally happy with, because then you've got all bases covered. So just do keep your options open, and don't move, whatever you do, don't move to an area where there's one school, and only one school that you would find acceptable. Common sense says be aware of the registration deadlines. If a school is oversubscribed, if it's popular, they will close their waiting lists and their registration lists up to a year in advance. So don't get caught out there. And another thing to bear in mind is with the private schools system, you should be aware that prep school applicants are at a distinct advantage when they're applying, even outside of London. They will be prepped for the interviews, and above all, the head will always have a relationship with the head teacher of the secondary school. So they're in a great position if your child is on the wait list to pick up the phone and say, right, please take this child. They are perfect for your school. Whereas a state primary will not be in quite such a strong position. So, I expect that some of you will have questions about really what the difference is between a really good primary school and a prep. And I would say that really is the main one. And actually, I should have said at the beginning, if you have any questions as we're going through, please do put them on the chat, and they will be sent to me at the end of the talk. So I'd love to hear and answer any questions that you might have. So please do that. Final point is, think about the commute to school. Again, it's really different outside of London. We don't have the vast public transport network, but what we do have is schools with fantastic fleets of private coaches that ship pupils far and wide in all directions. So again, with very similarly to London, actually, when you're living outside of London, you will find children travelling up to an hour by coach. But do think about whether or not that's what you want for your child when you're choosing where to live. Taking a look at state comprehensives and grammar schools. Again, familiarise yourself with everything that's required. Don't get caught out by living too far away. Many areas, there's a misconception that comprehensive schools are brilliant outside of London, and that you can move out and get this great education for your child for free. And in some areas that is absolutely the case. And as a country, as a nation, we are blessed with many fabulous state schools, but that's not the case everywhere. And ironically, a lot of people try to would decide that they want to move out of London to take advantage of the grammar school system. And if that is on your radar, just be very aware that, unfortunately, in grammar school areas, the state comprehensives tend not to be great. They're not necessarily terrible, but you will find better comprehensive schools elsewhere. It stands to reason that the best teachers and the brightest children end up landing in the grammar schools, which can leave the comprehensive schools in those areas a little bit lagging behind. So just be really aware of that. When we're looking at moving families out of London, we would always be looking for as many options as possible. So you want a good range of private options, good grammar schools, if it's in that area, good state schools, but also you do want that good state comprehensive to fall back on if your child doesn't get into grammar school. So please do bear that in mind. That notwithstanding that, many areas that don't have grammar schools do have fantastic comprehensive schools, and I guess that's the golden ticket in terms of moving out of London. Keep in mind entry points and application timelines, and if you're moving in year or outside of the normal timeframes of things, do bear in mind that just the same as in London, occasional places are very, very few and far between in the best state schools. And I'm sure you all know that you will need a local address to make a successful state school application. You'll already need to be living there. So just getting all those timings, getting those ducks lined up in a row is really key in terms of your move out of London. In terms of the detail of counties near London that have great schools, there's a real mix, actually. In Buckinghamshire and Berkshire, you have the grammar schools that I've already mentioned. They're mainly single sex. So again, that's another thing to think about. There are a couple of co-educational grammar schools, but they are mainly all boys or all girls, albeit they tend to be neighbouring, and they do have crossover in terms of activities, trips, etc. So there is scope for that mixing there. But they do have a very few good comprehensives. And in those two areas, because of the grammar schools, you'll tend to find that the independent schools, if that's on your radar, tend to be further away. So you might need to be popping your child on a bus or a coach to travel up to an hour away. And the other thing that I just wanted to say about grammar schools as well is there's also a misconception that once your child has passed the 11 plus, it's all systems go and they're into grammar school. That's not actually the case. So your child, how it works is your child passes the 11 plus, and then you're entered into the same process that you would be entered into if you were applying to a normal state school. So it then from there comes down to catchment and who lives the closest. So you may be in a situation where you don't get your first choice of grammar school. Or I have heard, unfortunately, of parents who, despite the fact that their child has passed the 11 plus, they don't get offered any grammar school at all if it's in a particularly high birth rate year. So do be aware of the pitfalls of grammar schools. And there are some areas that you can live in where you're in catchment for 2 or even 3 grammars. And if grammar schools are high on your wish list, then I would recommend that you try and do that. So if you don't get into your first choice, you've still got a chance at the others. So that's Buckinghamshire and Berkshire. Hertfordshire is another obviously really popular destination for people moving outside of London. Some really great schools in Hertfordshire, excellent around St Albans, and then more over easterly towards the Essex side as well. Lots of mixed comprehensive, some single sex. So I would say that Herts is a great county for state education. And there's a wide range of independent schools there as well, which cater for the most academic and less academic children as well. So Hertfordshire is a really excellent place to move to. Kent, a lot of people move out to Kent for the grammar schools. There are loads of grammar schools in Kent, which is really good news. But what that also means is there's a hierarchy amongst them. So there's a bit of homework to do for you mums and dads there to really find out which are the top grammar schools that you want to aim towards. Comprehensives are less good, and there are a smaller number of top independent schools, although still a good handful. Surrey, well known for its excellent state sector, very, very, very good comprehensives and a wide range of independent schools. No grammars though. So another great place to move to. But all of these places collectively offer some great options. And in terms of moving a little bit further out, other hotspots that you might consider looking at in terms of places where there are lots and lots of good education options. Oxfordshire, although bear in mind that the academic competition around Oxford can be similar to London because of the calibre of schooling and the type of parents that tend to live out there. Hampshire and Sussex also have some very, very good schools in the state and independent sectors. And then looking a little bit further afield, of course, there are more independent schools in London and the South East and that, the home counties. But if you wanted to go a little bit further, there are clusters of grammar schools around England, in the West Midlands, in Manchester, up north. Lancashire and North Yorkshire also have some grammar schools, so that's possibly worth looking at. Possibly if that's where you hail from originally, and you may be thinking about moving back. And then, interestingly, cathedral cities are often home to good independent schools. So places like Exeter, Winchester, York, Worcester, Norwich, as well. So lots of choice there. And then there's just a little note there if you're looking at moving further afield, perhaps back to Scotland or Wales. Obviously, they all have independent schools, which work in a similar way to those in England. Just worth mentioning that neither Scotland or Wales have any selective state schools, so no grammar schools there at all. But Northern Ireland does have some grammars. So that sort of encapsulates all the things that that you might want to start thinking about if you're looking at a move out of London. And it's very, very top line. So if anybody has any questions, please do feel free to send them in. Okay, I've just got one or two coming in here. Okay, so question 1. Grammar or state or independent, which are more readily available in the country? Well, in terms of the number of schools, there's a far greater number of state schools than there are independent schools, and there are relatively very few grammar schools. But of course, it's not always, not everyone has the choice of either paying for education or choosing a grammar school. So in terms of the numbers, definitely the state comprehensives are, and the state primary schools are far more readily available as a resource than the other two mentioned. Someone else has texted, is there a best way to manage the chicken and egg situation of finding a new home and the school not accepting until you have a confirmed address? That's a really good question, and it is the chicken and egg analogy is absolutely right. The best time really to move, although it's not always the most convenient time from a lifestyle perspective, is when you have a baby. So to get them into a local nursery, which then moves them onto the state primary school and so forth into secondary education, that is without doubt your easiest option. But I would say that as I said at the beginning, the narrative that exists in London of if you haven't done it now, you're too late, you're missing the boat all the time. That isn't the case outside of London as much. And occasional places do come up, particularly in the home counties. Communities are still quite transient. So people do get relocated overseas or sent to another country, or, people's circumstances change and they decide to move. So there are the possibility of occasional places, but really it's either the best time to move is either before your child is, when your child is a baby, before they're ready to start school at all, or when they are pre-reception, so that if you can get into that perfect school at reception, then you're on the right path. The secondary school transfer is more difficult because it would involve you up sticksing midway through the primary years, which is really difficult, but as I say, not impossible. And we, as consultants, we help families do that all the time. There's a bit of jeopardy involved, and it's a little bit of more of a white knuckle ride than it is with people who have got their ducks in a row sort of very early on, but it can be done. Next question. Virtual schools and colleges, and is this something that's being provided or not so much? Well, that's a really interesting question. Virtual schools are definitely something that we are very much aware of. We review a handful on our website. I think that the thing that I would say is there are many popping up, and it's really critical as a parent to go with one that's been around for a long time, that's well established. I am a bit concerned that some of them will prove to be a flash in the pan, born out of the pandemic. So yes, they exist. Yes, some of them are very good, but be careful to do your due diligence and make sure that they are very well established. And if it's a secondary school you're after, make sure that they have passed a good number of students through the GCSE and A-level years, so that they have a good track record. So really, really important to do your homework on that one and make sure the due diligence is done. Next question from a person who would love a private school education but may struggle with the fees, and is there any help available? There definitely is help available. Again, another big area to research, but most private schools offer bursary provision to children whose parents are not able to afford the fees, and that can be either partial or it could be 100% of the fees. So it could be a little bit of help or all. The thing that you have to be very aware of is that your financial situation would be under intense scrutiny. So you have to be prepared to be very, very open with the school in question. But yes, it is definitely feasible, and there are more bursaries around than people are aware of. We have a service that can help parents find bursaries for their children, and we also have some very good articles about finding a bursary on our website. So by all means, do go onto thegoodschoolsguide.co.uk and read those articles, because they might have some good tips in. But don't be afraid to pick up the phone to schools and ask them about bursary provision, and they will be able to send you all the information and help you from there. Interestingly, scholarships now are far less financially focused. So a scholarship may offer up to 10% off fees, but they are pretty much for kudos nowadays, rather than financial support. So do pick up the phone to the schools that you're interested in, find out what the bursary provision is, and yeah, there's plenty out there. Next question. Yeah, I think that is all your questions for now. But please do email in if you have any further questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, and it's been a delight to talk to you.